Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Around Christmas every year, thousands line up for Christmas cake in Kolkata. It's quite a plummy tradition, and the most famous bakery when it comes to Christmas cakes is Nahum's, the last Jewish bakery in Kolkata. The line there goes around the block, but many small bakeries also rent their ovens to those making Christmas cakes. There, most of the bakers are Muslim. A Christian festival, Muslim bakers, a Jewish bakery, and those eating the cake, mostly Hindu. It's pretty much Indian secularism baked into a fruitcake. Yet many worry that secularism, Indian style, is under tremendous assault and endangered, unlike the fruitcake. Pseudo-secular has become a common term of abuse. 75 years after independence, is secularism still half-baked in India? Rajeev Bhargava, the founder-director of the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, is the author of the book Reimagining Indian Secularism. Rajeev Bhargava, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we talk about reimagining Indian secularism, maybe we should talk about how it was imagined in the first place. So at the time when India was grappling with the idea of secularism, what kind of models were out there? What were the basic differences between them?
As you know, the word model is a term that is used only by academics or by scientists, but I don't think any political activist, any politician who was in the field was using the word model. But they had ideas of, how religion-state relationships have been established in France or in Europe or in America. And I think those three models did play an important role. In America, broadly, the understanding was, although this was not always done in practice, the understanding was that religion and the state must be excluded from one another. That is to say, the two have completely independent spheres of jurisdiction, and the state will not interfere in the affairs of religion, and religion will not get into the affairs of the state. So it's sometimes, people like Thomas Jefferson in the late 18th century had referred to it as a wall. There's a wall of separation between the church and the state. Religion was never without the church, and there were many such churches. And each felt that they possessed the true doctrine. And there was naturally some kind of conflict between them. So just to prevent this conflict from taking place between different churches, the idea was that if the state did not back one or the other, they will sort it out themselves. That was one idea. The other idea was that each individual, and this is extremely important, each individual should be able to form an association, religious association, and this pluralism within Protestant Christianity should grow. Later on, when the idea of democracy grew, it was the political sphere which also benefited from the absence of religion, because religion had no idea of equality of citizenship, and so equality of citizenship grew from a republican tradition. Now, in Europe, secularism grew after a solution had been found to the wars of different religious sects that emerged after the breakdown of Latin Christendom. And one formula that was adopted by everybody in Europe was one king, one faith, one law. So the king had to announce or publicly confess which church he was wedded to, and everybody living in his or her territory also embraced that church. And those who did not embrace that church were either expelled or exterminated, or they had to live a very private, invisible existence. So this idea, the last idea is what is understood by toleration. We will tolerate people as long as they don't appear in the public domain. You must see that some of this happening in our context as well. And the state had a very strong alliance with the church. But this church was politically meddlesome and it was socially oppressive. So when demands for equality and freedom grew from 18th century onwards, the church was the state was on the side of individual freedom and the church was against it. So there were a lot of what are called unchurching movements. The demand that religion should be excluded, the church and state should be separated. This happened throughout Europe. And over a period of time, after major struggles took place between the church and the state, some peace was established, some arrangement was established whereby both can have their own spheres of influence. In France, on the other hand, it was a Catholic country and the church was very, very strong. So the battle between the church and the state was quite bitter. The state became hostile to religion, persistently hostile to religion. It was always suspicious of religion, and they wanted religion not to be in the public domain at all. So the idea that religion should be privatized and that nobody should enter the public domain with their religious identity. So Jews can be citizens, but as long as they cease to be Jews in public. So this was a very strict sort of what is called laïcité in France. This was a rather robust regime which had no tolerance for religion.
When India, and I'll just say loosely, did this let's respect everybody's religion kind of secularism, when they chose that, was there a model for that anywhere else? I'm using the word model again.
Yeah, it was not that they were blindly following what was happening in Europe. They also tried to develop their own thinking on these issues. The first major difference between Europe and America, and France included, is that India was phenomenally diverse from the point of view of religion. Massive. I mean, Muslims constituted virtually 25% of the Indian population. There were Buddhists, there were Jains, there were Christians, there were Parsis, there were even Jews. There were Sikhs, and there were, of course, the Adivasis, and there were wide varieties of Hinduism. So when the conflict began in India, predominantly between Hindus and Muslims, people like Gandhi, the first thing they thought was that somehow we should establish peace between them. And they did not entertain the idea that they should be expelled or exterminated. They developed a model of secularism which would respect all religions and which will ensure the state has to be impartial. So there has to be some distance between the state and all these religions, and we have to make sure that each one of them works more or less autonomously and without sort of coming into conflict with each other.
So basically here we were looking at trying to prevent a sort of inter-religious issues, whereas in the West it was more intra-religious domination that they were trying to address, like using secularism. But was Gandhi's notion of secularism different from Nehru's? I assume that eventually what became Indian constitutional secularism is more Nehru's than Gandhi's, or am I wrong?
Nehru and Ambedkar, and I would say Ambedkar even more than Nehru, and even to some extent Gandhi, all of them understood that while resolving the inter-religious dispute or inter-religious domination is extremely important and ethically desirable, despite even the partition, because there were a huge number of Muslims still in India, and there were Christians and Sikhs. And so you have to make sure that there is no obvious Hindu dominance. So to curb inter-religious domination, you have to have an impartial state which keeps itself away from or has a distance from different religious communities. So this was unique about India. Unlike the West, where you rightly said is intra-religious issues, most of the Catholics were fighting their own church. But we also had very strong intra-religious issues. Relations within religions were full of discrimination, horrendously degrading practices, humiliating practices. The caste issue had to be settled, and the women's question also had to be examined. So Hindu women had to be protected from Hindu men, Muslim women had to be protected from Muslim women, and likewise Dalit, or what were called oppressed classes at that time, were to be protected from the upper castes. And so Indian secularism had to deal, unlike in the West, it had to deal not only with intra but also inter-religious issues. So if we had borrowed the American model, we would simply not be able to ban untouchability, for example, or open public wells to everybody, because that would have been against some religious customs. And the state is not supposed to legislate against religion or in favor of religion.
But when we're talking about the state, what did Gandhi believe should be the role of the state in this? Because his main ethos was also that the main responsibility for maintaining communal harmony and amity lay within the community. So did he think of that the state should have a role, whether it's equal distance or equal closeness?
No. So I think as far as peace is concerned between religious communities, and as far as equal impartial treatment to all religious communities, if secularism just meant that, Gandhi was very much for a secular state. But you're absolutely right. For Gandhi, the role of the state, unlike Nehru, and unlike people who actually made the constitution, for example, Ambedkar, they wanted to give the state, a more greater role in bringing about reforms and bringing about positive changes in improving society. They did not think that the community on its own can do it, because each community was dominated by its very orthodox leaders. And there was very little voice for either Dalits or for women. Right? So if we depend upon only the community, then no reforms will take place. So in the Constitution, we have banned untouchability, right? Which goes against the American idea. But we also have equal respect for all religions, which is, again, a non-European idea. So you see how distinctive India is. On the one hand, it is interfering in religion. On the other hand, it refrains from interfering in religion. And it can do both, as long as it does it in an impartial manner with respect to all religious communities. So I've called it a critical respect. The state has to have critical respect with respect to all religions. Each religion has dissent within it. And you have to assess that the nature of the dissent. If the dissent is in favor of change, which is encouraged by the Constitution, then the state must support the dissenters. If, on the other hand, dissent comes from the orthodoxy, which is against the Constitution, then the state must actually, curb the dissenters rather than encourage them.
That's very tricky, obviously, right? I mean, it's easier in some ways to have an across-the-board, hands-off religions tolerance for the state, because you can't really dole out critical respect in equal measure to all religions, because somebody will say, my religion is getting more criticism than respect.
No,
right?
Equal is not the right word, but principled and impartial is better. In a democratic state particularly, no policy is formed instantly. No law is passed instantly. There is a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion, both inside and outside the parliament. If there is an authoritarian state, it can implement one thing for everybody. But if there is a democratic state, it will have to take everybody into account and do it slowly. Now, the reform in Hindu personal law, which is an interference according to some people, in Hindu religion, although some people can argue that it's not a religious issue, it's a purely social issue. This idea of reforming personal laws was an old idea, but it took still 10 years, literally 9 years after independence, for it to be enacted. And the reason why it was enacted in Hindus is because the Indian parliament was dominated by Hindus. And many of them were progressive, some of them were not progressive, but they consulted each other. And finally, because of Ambedkar and because of a long-standing commitment to Dalits and to women, and because it was more in keeping with society we imagined for our future, an equal, free and just society, Hindus were able to reform some of their laws, but they could not do it for Muslims, because the representation of Muslims was very little in the parliament, and the debate had barely started outside the parliament. Women were hardly speaking. The injustices they suffered were barely expressed in public. And after partition, in any case, a lot of people were wary of, too much kind of negative interference in minority communities. So I think in the 50s, I would say it was practically impossible to do anything about personal laws among Muslims. But it stood as an aberration, and rightly so. And something should have happened in the 60s or the 70s. But that is when the mistakes really happened. I wouldn't blame people in the 50s for not doing very much in a parliament which is dominated by... So Hindus can easily say, look, we are the representatives. We are the true spokesmen of Hindus. And we want changes. And the changes took place. And they could defeat their orthodoxy even within the Congress.
Right.
And Ambedkar being at the helm, he was a liberal, he was for equality, he was for justice, like Nehru was, and like many others were. Many people were like that.
But you also write Ambedkar himself did not think the word secular was necessary, that it was already subsumed in the idea of a liberal democracy.
No, there was a major debate that took place in the Constituent Assembly over the word secular. I think it was wise for them because secularism meant so many different things. It had an anti-religious connotation. It had a hands-off, secular being indifferent to religion or keeping away from religion. So because of those, and Indians were trying to introduce a new meaning to the word secular. So because of this ambiguity in the word and because of the multiple meanings of the word, the potential for misunderstanding secularism was so much that people decided not to use the word secular. And it was very wise. The concept was there, word was not used. And I don't know if there's a connection between the two, but in 1976, when through a constitutional amendment, the word secular was introduced, I think all the troubles of secularism began then. I'm not saying that one was caused by the other, but it's probably not just a coincidence. I think sometimes it's wiser not to name things.
Or should they have found a different word that didn't already have so many different loaded meanings for different people?
Yeah, you have to be very inventive. And then you have to do a lot of groundwork for that word to become acceptable to people. I mean, all these words, dharma nirpekshita, sarva dharma sambhav, these are all terms that very people on the ground understand. Nirpekshita is so difficult to understand.
So basically what you're saying here is also that from the outset, the Indian idea of secularism was not just about tolerance or harmony between religions and within a religion, but it had a transformational agenda built into it as well, which is also different from the West.
No. The transformational agenda is not different from the West. It is the harmony agenda which is different from the West. And of course, what we are transforming here was also different. We didn't have a church here, so there was no battle with the church. But we have the institution of caste. It was very hierarchical, and we had to battle against caste hierarchy.
So what would you say was one of the first major mistakes secularists made where you started diluting the idea or losing sight of the whole point behind what the framers had intended?
I think the idea is extremely good. I think it's something which is homegrown. It is an Indian thing. We have invented enough within secularism, like we've invented enough in cricket, all the wrist work that came through Ranjit Singh ji and Gundappa Vishwanath and Azharuddin and, the mastery of spin that Indians have and the way they've introduced changes in bowling. Those are all something which is the Indian contribution to cricket. We have Indian cricket. These are all transnational things. Our ideas are not frozen where they are first began. They travel and they change. And secularism should be seen like that. We should talk about an Indian contribution to, say, secularism. I think the first mistake we made was that we became complacent in the 60s. Once you changed the personal laws of Hindus, you should have found a way to change the personal laws of other religious communities. And this is a fault of both the leaders of those communities and those who have been in power, the government. There were movements within Muslims. There is the Satyashodhak Samaj in Maharashtra, led by Hamid Dalwai, very, very influential, radical figure who wanted to change Muslim personal laws. And they were not only vocal, but they acted publicly. But I think, I don't know, it just fizzled out. By the 80s, it had become, I think, the charge of appeasement of Muslim orthodoxy. We shouldn't say Muslims because it's just a Muslim orthodoxy. I think that sense, to me, is correct. But it's not just one party. Every party did it.
So it's not just like Shabano or the satanic verses you're saying. There's more than that.
Those are the most visible, obvious examples. We should never have taken a step to ban the satanic verses. We had no reason to. Why the hell did we have to? Khomeini's ban came later, and they started to play this electoral game. On the one side, you have a ban on satanic verses. You want to reverse the judgment of Shah Bano. And on the other side, you're opening the locks of the Babri Masjid. This kind of opportunistic distance from religion. I call it multi-communal, right? That you appease the most fanatical fringe of all religious communities instead of critical respect, which is the original idea. Not to forget what happened in 1984. I don't understand this as much as I should. I don't understand this politics very well. But my view is that a secular state cannot not act if a whole the most venerated place for a religious community is taken over by militants and becomes a storehouse of ammunition. On the other hand, you have to make sure that if you want to remove these militants and these ammunition from the temple, you don't destroy the temple. I mean, the only way in which the militants could be removed is by taking a lot of Sikhs into confidence. And any military operation should have been conducted by Sikhs predominantly, because then it is one progressive section of the Sikhs doing something to a very extremist, regressive section of the same community.
When Indira Gandhi is assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards and people say she was warned not to have them and she insisted that, they would not, that she would keep them, that was shown as an example of an innate kind of secular feeling that you don't punish the community for the acts of some of them.
I agree. I think individuals, the people like Mrs. Gandhi were very complicated, complex creatures. On the Hindu-Muslim front, I think she was doing pretty well, I think, in the 70s. But the Sikh issue, she retained that Nehru secular element in her as an individual, but institutionally and in political practice, somehow things didn't quite work out the way she wanted. Or perhaps she didn't want it because, maybe she was plainly opportunistic, because maintaining power is not an easy job.
Which begs the question, is secularism, the way you have been talking about it, then while extremely desirable on paper, is it for a political party, it's not a particularly, it's not a shortcut to power. It's not an easy way to hold on to power, which is why most political parties, at the best pay lip service to it.
I would not be that pessimistic. I think there are better ways of practicing politics which are consistent, but not with a perfectionist secularism, but with an acceptable secularism. But the other thing is that no change takes place in a linear manner, and certainly not in democratic societies. You will have to take 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. There will be a backlash. Anybody whose privilege is taken is going to react back, and there will be a struggle. You should be ready for that struggle. That's what I meant by complacency. But the basic framework has to remain. See, we cannot slip back and destroy everything in such a way that it will become impossible for us to rebuild it. I think what we are witnessing today is dismantling, but we are not seeing something better being replaced.
I read this quote by Arun Shourie, and he said that 3 things are teaching Hindus to become Islamic. One is the double standards of secularists, the demonstrated success of Muslims in bending both state and secularists by intimidation, and that both state and secularists pay attention to sentiments of Hindus only when Hindus become a little Islamic. Do you think it's a valid point?
There's something in it. I won't say there's nothing to it. I myself, without reading Arun Shourie, I've written in my own books. I put it differently and not blaming anybody, but I see it as a mistake, that the burden of defending secularism should not fall on the minorities and on pro-Muslim secularists. When I say pro-Muslim, I don't mean that they have some innate protective sentiment towards Muslims of all kinds. I don't think a genuine secularist is doing that. But I think both these have been forced to defend Muslims because of the assault on those Muslims. I think the focus should shift not just on inter-religious, but on intra-religious issues. The Hindu state is looking for reforms in Muslim community, which is crazy. That reform has to come from within Muslims. If you are a Hindu state, you should focus on reforming Hindus, not attacking Muslims and protecting all the conservative elements within Hindus.
But that's also happened because the opponents of secularism have kind of been able to target secularism and paint it as something anti-Hindu. So how can you change the debate to say that practicing Hindus need secularism too?
Hindus have to be saved from their own orthodoxies, from their own conservative elements, from their own fanatical and extremist people, from those who are misinterpreting Hinduism and distorting it. And it's the function of secular people and the secular state to prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, what is happening is exactly the opposite. The state itself is involved in distortion of Hinduism. The kind of Hindu sentiment that we're creating. We are now encouraging people to believe that the only way that you can be a good Hindu is by being an anti-Muslim. This is ridiculous.
So would you say, in a way now, not only is there a push towards majoritarianism, but that majoritarianism is getting dressed up as a new kind of secularism? It's being painted as secularism in a certain way.
There was a time in the late 90s, during certainly the Babri Masjid, that entire Rath Yatra and that movement, the argument was that we are the truth. The Hindu or Hindu biased party was claiming to be secular and was saying that others are pseudo-secular. No party which is biased in favor of the majority can be secular. It's as simple as that.
But one of the things you are sort of interrogating in your book is that you're saying that in order to reimagine the secularism and reclaim it perhaps to the original ideas, it will also be necessary for us to examine the idea of what religion itself means in India, because it's become almost glib to say India is a very religious country. You know, the Rig Veda was composed here so many thousands of years ago. But you're saying that this idea of religion itself, you know, what is religion and whether it is innate to India also will have to be re-examined.
Nehru was very ambivalent about the use of both secular and religion. He was not very happy with either of these two terms. Gandhi was certainly against modern religion. He was using religion because it became the currency in which to express religiosity, which is a different thing altogether. It is true that religion was invented in the 16th, 17th century during the wars of Europe.
So how do you make that distinction between religiosity that existed in India, you know, what we are finding in the Vedas, and religion?
The Vedic worldview was all about a good life in the world here and now. There was no idea of God. There was no idea of rebirth. At best, some of them thought that they will be transferred to another place in the cosmos. That death means you leave this earth and move to another loka. I mean, Swarga Lok is thought to be somewhere in the Milky Way, but it was very much part of the universe. There's no idea of a transcendental world of the kind that the Christians and the Muslims have thought. And then the new ideas emerged for Buddhism, Jainism, and later Christianity and Islam, that no justice in this life, suffering in this life, in this world. So you have to either escape from suffering altogether, or you have to think of another world. So the idea of two worlds emerged. The idea of radical transcendence emerged. But human being very diverse, they follow different paths. They have different value systems, they have different ethics. Some are reason-based, some are not reason-based, and so on. But there is another thing that was introduced at a certain point. Some people argue that was done in Egypt by the ancient Egyptians, but it was certainly something became central to the Jewish, very Christian, and later Islamic traditions. The idea of true and false. There is one true God, and all other gods are false. And those who follow false gods, they are not only misguided, but they have to either follow the one God or they are enemies to be fought. It's only played havoc everywhere. In our own times, it has come to, as I said, a certain kind of scientific communism, which was followed in the Soviet Union or in other parts of, in China or other parts of the world. Only scientific truth is meaningful. Only scientific statements are meaningful. All non-scientific statements are not only not true, they're meaningless. That's an absurd idea that came in the early 20s in Vienna, in the Viennese Circle and so on. And then it has come to nationalism, exclusionary nationalisms. Only one true Hindu. All others are anti-Hindu, even though they are Hindus. Only one way of belonging to the Hindu nation. All other ways are false. And those who are false are anti-national and they have to be excluded or exterminated. There is no way that you can live with other Hindus, leave alone other religions. Now, this is a new thing in Hinduism. Hinduism has never had this radical distinction between true and false. And even people who came with the idea abandoned that idea and became accepted that all paths are equally true, or if not equally true, at least true to some extent.
Valid.
They're valid. We may be better than them, but they also have something to contribute. They are worse than us, but they also have some truth. This is the standard idea in India, which is hierarchical pluralism of a certain kind. Everybody is there, but everybody is not there in the same way. So it's not that everybody is equal. Vedic Brahmins are better than Buddhists, but Buddhists are also in search of something from which we can learn. Now, this is an idea which is absent in religion, and that's what I call religionization. When Hindus abandon this idea of a continuum of truth and adopt a dichotomy of true and false, then they take a very major step towards becoming a religion.
So given that, Rajeev, does the liberal rhetoric about saying, okay, secularism is under such attack now, some people will say it's even on the ventilator, does that rhetoric about reclaiming secularism work? Because you're saying it has to be reimagined rather than restored, because restoring is a conservative idea, but reimagining is not necessarily that.
Yeah, so I deliberately use the word of reimagination. We've forgotten, unlike Gandhi, who never accepted this modern idea of religion. We use the word religion, but in the traditional sense, which was far more common in Asia and certainly in India. In China, for example, in pre-communist China, and even after communism, China has different ways, Daos, right? And there is no conflict. Each Chinese is a Buddhist, a Taoist, a Confucian, and some of them are also members of the Communist Party. But it's not as if one is contradicting the other. So nationalism everywhere of a certain kind has gone against their own very vibrant traditions. It's a very powerful force. Not the nationalism of the anti-colonial struggle, which was trying to take this idea forward, but other nationalisms, which are more ethnic, whether based on religion or language, they have turned against that civilizational idea because in the interests of power and becoming great like others. So in that sense, this idea of religion has become very strong, and we have been religionized, and it'll take a long time for us to de-religionize ourselves. Reimagining secularism is no longer something that can take place in 10 years, 20 years. It's a long-term project. Fortunately for India, religionization in many places is partial and incomplete. They have not embraced religion. They do not accept that you have to be this or that. They do not know that theirs is the true religion and others are false. Large number of people. The big sort of movements, the Ram, Krishna, Shiva, the Vishnu, ordinary people have still got their own gods and goddesses. There are little shrines to Mata, Devi, Santosh. New gods are born, new goddesses are born, Santoshi Ma, this, that, and people pray to them rather than to these big gods. They are encapsulated now under this umbrella, but if you just scratch the surface and go a little beneath, you'll find still new gods being invented, multiple gods. In many places in Rajasthan, Muslims are treated as another jati. In Western UP, being a Jat is much more important in some contexts than being Hindu or Muslim. There are Hindu Jats, there are Muslim Jats, there are Sikh Jats, and the culture of Jats has a much greater salience than the culture of Hindus and Muslims. This is what, communalization is making people forget their Jat identity and see themselves as Hindus or Muslims. And that happens for votes. But as we saw in the farmers' movement, Muslim Jats and Hindu Jats came together. Ram Rahim. If you look at the followers, there are women, there are men, there are Hindus, there are Muslims, there are people from different castes. All of them come together and become followers. They are not looking at it as a religion. They're looking at it as a path for salvation of some kind, for self-fulfillment of some kind. Of course, what he does is another matter. What many of these Babas do, they're mafia dons. But many followers are not like them. You may say that they are duped, but you may say that they are still offering them something which is very much part of the old Indian tradition. So there are lots of places in India where such rigid categorical identities have not still developed. As a secularist, the first thing we must do is to protect those zones. And that is a very long-term project, but it's also something which is doable because it's already there on the ground.
And we'll have to leave it at that. Rajeev Bhargava, thank you so much for talking about reimagining Indian secularism with us.
Thanks.
Professor of Political Science Rajeev Bhargava is the founder-director of the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. He's the author of books like The Promise of India's Secular Democracy and Secularism and Its Critics, and most recently, Reimagining Indian Secularism. Send us your thoughts wherever you get your podcast from. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Thanks as always for listening. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.